Welcome everybody, this is Tim Watrous, President of Digital Advisors.
And this is Kevin Gordon, President of Capital Advisors Group.
We'd like to welcome you to our K-12 Politics and Tech video series.
Our objective is to give you the absolute latest of what's going on in Sacramento that affects public school districts, obviously, and as well as all the technology stuff that's going on that's so vital to delivering for kids these days.
And remember, if you find these videos useful, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and share out over social media. You're our marketing team. We appreciate your support, and let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody. I'm Tim Watrous, President of Digital Advisors, here with a live episode of K-12 Politics and Tech. As always, co-host Kevin Gordon, President of Capital Advisors is here. Kevin, glad to have you.
Glad to be with you. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, and frequent favorite guest, former Governor Bob Wise, served in Congress for many years, helped start a little organization you may have heard of called Future Ready. Bob is very kind to show up on this show and share with us what's going on in DC. So Bob, so glad you're here. Thanks for joining.
Good to be here and report that something's finally happened.
Yeah, well, and a couple of other contributors that we love to have on the show. Lindsay Dyer is our Senior Director of Client Engagement at Digital Advisors, works directly with all of our clients. And Lindsay, so glad that you're here today to share your expertise.
Very good.
And you may be on mute, but that's all right. and Brian Olson, we had you on the show probably about a month or so ago. Brian is our top cybersecurity expert on the Digital Advisors team. Brian also reports directly to Governor Gavin Newsom and runs a cybersecurity task force for the state of California. Brian, we're so glad to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Sure thing, Tim. Good to be here.
Excellent. So everyone, thanks for joining. I think before we went into the weekend, we had about 150 people registered because we planned this over the holiday, which nobody's checking their email. But we're up over 750 attendees, which is kind of staggering. But we're really all glad that you're here, and we're happy to share this broadcast with you. For those of you who are not familiar, we actually do this every week. This is a free channel on YouTube that you can go to, K-12 Politics and Tech. We're going to put some links out in the emails that went out to everybody. But please feel free to jump on there and subscribe to that YouTube channel. We do an under 30-minute show of some major things that impact you every day as an education leader. And we're glad you're here and happy to get started. So everybody's really anxious to hear, Bob, what's going on with this new stimulus. We know we got it passed. There was a 5,500-page document, which I know you've studied extensively. Can you just tell us what's up with this new stimulus and what should people expect?
So the good news is that in past shows, we've talked about politics and possibilities. Now we actually are able to talk about planning and process and in the implementation for district leaders. So quick recap. Important news is that more federal funds are soon going to be coming to education. And I want to thank, for the slides that we're going to be seeing, I want to thank Capital Advisors for a very thorough job of putting them together. The quick and dirty on it is many of you followed in early December, a bipartisan group of senators. These were not the ones normally out front. These are often the ones behind the scenes. They came together with a proposal that essentially was adopted. It was for $900 billion, which became the basis for the final package that the president signed December 27th or 28th. So why was this particular package successful when they've been failing since essentially last April? The reason is the economy is tanking and in bad shape. Coronavirus is spiking, as we know only too well, particularly in California. The eviction deadline was running out, and so millions were facing eviction on January the 1st, as well as unemployment benefits running out. And finally, some politics got in there. The Georgia Senate race, which is being held today as we're speaking, the Georgia Senate race would determine the control of the Senate, a lot of political stakes riding. So let's quickly talk about what is this and the highlights of this package. And you can see the highlighted portion of the Capital Advisors slide here. There were actually two funding packages joined together. The first was the regular education appropriations bill. That you're familiar with that. You get it every year. Provides the Title I funding, the other funding programs for education for K-12, pre-K to K-12. Just a note, and it's covered in the PowerPoint slide later, there's some slight increases from last year, but no great differences. And what important thing for district leaders, that means that you really there are no great differences in the way you operate, in the way you use these federal funds. That's the traditional appropriations bill. That was then joined with this stimulus package. The appropriation bill was 1.4 trillion. The stimulus package was 82 billion. And so most of our discussion today is going to be about the stimulus package. So, and we'll be covering what's in it. And also at the end, I'm going to cover a little bit about what isn't in it that you need to be aware of and that will affect your life as a district leader. So all the Capital Advisor slides provide these details. So some highlights. Look at the yellow highlighted part. That shows you the national allocation. So for education total, out of 900 billion, 82 billion went to education. K-12 schools got 54 billion, essentially through Title I allocation. Higher education gets 22 billion, and the governor will get $4 billion. And I know Kevin's going to talk about that a little more. I want you to look at the column next to it, the March CARES Act funding, because that shows you what in the last stimulus bill that passed, what went to these various components. And so you can see that this provision, this portion, this stimulus bill was significantly larger. And then also there's some additional provisions, $7 billion in different broadband components, additional dollars for childcare and nutrition that will be discussed shortly. So that's the highlights of this bill. It is now law, and the money is actually beginning to flow, and the requirements for it will be, and how it gets out will be written. But I do want to note something, and Kevin, here I'm going to hand it off to you as you talk about how it affects California. I do note that the amount that went to K-12 last time was about $13 billion. This is $54 billion. Does that mean that it's 4 times as great for a district leader?
Right. And so, yes, on this particular part of stimulus, the thing that it's real important to note is that when we did get stimulus last March, we got it in 4 different pots that schools did across the state of California. One of the major areas that we got funded was from dollars that actually were not really even intended to go to K-12. This is last March, and it was the coronavirus relief funds. The governor ended up giving this staggering amount of money out of that fund to schools. And the amount that actually came as a result of Ester, which is the $54 billion that is on this chart, that came to California, was just one of 4 pots of money. So yeah, that pot, the ESSER pot, this 54 billion, is indeed quite a bit more than that one pot was back in March. But school districts got money from a lot of other resources out of the overall CARES Act and state funding at that time. So one of the things that I wanted to kind of inoculate against was that when districts hear that the amount of money that Congress has passed for schools this time is so much more than it did in the springtime, it's actually not more than we saw in California school districts as a total of the money that we got from feds from all 4 pots back then. There's only 1 pot now. Yes, it's a big pot of money, but into the totality of the money, it actually matches basically what we got last spring. The reason why this is important is because the one pot that we are really going to get, the biggest pot, which is the ESSER pot, the ESSER pot, this $54 billion, that amount of money is going to be distributed based on Title I. And Title I will result in the fact that there are going to be probably 100 districts that don't get anything. They just don't have, they don't qualify for, or they didn't apply for Title I funding. When we looked at those different pots last spring, almost every district got money. They got some significant money out of the 4 different pots because they all had different criteria. You remember one of them was distributed based on your special ed population. One of them was distributed based on LCFF. Another was distributed based on supplemental concentration grant. And then finally, we had the ESSER pot that was distributed based on Title I. So we had lots of different distribution models. So this time around, when you take a look at this new ESSER out of 54 billion.
Actually, hey, Kevin, I just want to add one thing, because we've been doing this show since the pandemic started. And we were on so many times. I just want to point out how challenging this was to get the stimulus through. we thought there was going to be stimulus so many times between March and the holidays. And really what it came down to is at some point we had given up hope, and we thought that we just weren't going to see a stimulus till Biden took over. But we do, as we mentioned in an earlier broadcast, if you haven't seen it, we all have to send a nice thank you card to Georgia, because those elections seemed, based on what you had said, Bob, were sort of the pivotal, storyline to urge that stimulus before the year ended, before this vote. So without that strife in Georgia, we might not be looking at anything till later in the spring. So again, we can all thank Georgia for that. And I think it's really important to note that we were very close to not having any stimulus this time.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that's important to note is that, as California school districts were looking at the whole specter of stimulus and maybe would we get another package, might remember that the focus actually wasn't on education originally. It was in the governor's budget that said we need to figure out how to net $14 billion of additional money from a subsequent stimulus package in order to make the governor's budget work. Well, surprise, surprise, the governor's budget forecast of a huge drop in revenues really didn't happen. And so the pressure for us to get stimulus dollars generally to help the state of California wasn't as great. And the political interest back in Washington, D.C. wasn't there. The president and Republicans in both houses weren't wild about a stimulus package that would largely benefit blue states like ours. And so then it sort of shifted to say, look, if we don't get stimulus that helps out state and local governments, maybe we can get stimulus that helps out schools, because the president and congressional Republicans in both houses seem to be sympathetic to an education package. And we pushed and pushed. There were times we got really close, so close that, Bob, you had to bring a fork and a knife to one of our broadcasts to eat some crow, because we really thought something was going to pass.
Yeah, I've been predicting it for a long time. And unfortunately, Tim, you kept reminding me, you just reminded people of how many times I said yes and it didn't happen. But as a friend of mine just noted, the devil went down to Georgia and actually came back with a stimulus package, and which is going to have direct impact over the next, well, actually almost year and a half for districts, but particularly California share. And Kevin, what does that look like?
Yeah, so it's the $6.8 billion, the estimate of what California ends up. And then there's a couple more items here on this slide that I want to talk about. One of the things I do want to remind everybody that's watching is that the slides that you're seeing us present off of are a mere outline of a very detailed PowerPoint that Capital Advisors has created that is linked to this presentation. You will want to download that. So we've got a real PowerPoint presentation by Capital Advisors that's in a great deal of detail on all of this stuff. And what we encourage you to do is download those slides, and like Capital Advisors always does, we invite you to use those slides. You don't have to attribute it to us. We'd like you to, but you want to use them with your boards. You're going to have a lot of the detail. I'm going to reference that occasionally here as we get into this. So Rachel, let's look at the next point on the stimulus update.
And if I could just add,
Yeah.
Kevin, this is as thorough a presentation, the total package that people can download. I've been surveying a lot of national sites. This is as thorough a one on how this actually works as I've seen to date.
No, I really appreciate that, Bob. And I think combined with our narrative, people know that this is recorded, so you come back and look at it again for any of these details. That combined with the PowerPoint that you will link to has a lot of details that you're going to want. So the first question is what's allowed? And I'm telling you, you could spend a lot of time combing through this legislation on the stacks of detail with regard to what's allowed, but it actually can be broken down pretty simply. The first starts with the fact that just like ESSER last spring authorized the expenditure of money for any purposes that are aligned with the major federal programs that already exist, programs that you know, like Title I, like IDEA, like the Perkins Act for CTE type programs, the McKinney-Vento Homeless Act, all of these major federal education programs, what the underlying purposes are of those programs, you can spend any of this money for the furtherance of any of those things. That makes this pretty broad, right, Bob? I mean, those laws are really broad.
Yeah, Title I had gotten broader under ESSA. It got expanded significantly under CARES and now under this, and as you're going to talk about in a minute, even some additional uses.
Correct. And then so last spring, they also published a list of acceptable uses for Ester funds. And a lot of that was focused on mitigating the COVID virus. It was very heavily focused on distance learning, on devices, on connectivity. All of that appears again. Those exact same items appear again. And in fact, when you look at the 15 or so items that are added to those areas of federal law that are allowed, only about 3 of them are new. And I mentioned them here. A big focus on learning loss is new. Facility upgrades that are necessary and help mitigate COVID type activities, and indoor air quality are areas that have been added. And again, in the PowerPoint that is linked to this presentation, again, it's not the slides you're seeing now, but the detailed PowerPoint that you will find linked to this presentation, you're going to find a lot of this detail there that'll give you more guidance on exactly how you can use this money. But one of the things that we wanted to emphasize that we saw in the use of the overwhelming majority of the money in the spring, we expect to be replicated again with the money that you're going to now have. And that is a focus on technology, a focus on devices and connectivity, and just planning generally. But one of the things that we really wanted to emphasize is that, we were in the middle of a crisis. So districts were doing what they could immediately to get distance learning up and running. And there was a lot of money spent, a lot of decisions that were made that maybe if you had the luxury of time, those decisions could have been maybe different than they were. What we're going to have now with this extra shot of resources is the opportunity to go back and think a little more carefully about how you might want to deploy resources, do things that make some sense in the broader scheme of things in terms of teaching and learning, and how we also need to anticipate that we're never going to be pulling devices back from kids. We've now gotten to that point where, kids are in sort of a one-to-one environment. They're going to be having these devices, and that we are going to want to deploy strategies of even when we get back to in-person instruction, how do we maximize the use of technology now that we were sort of shoved into this realm of really integrating technology into everyday teaching and learning. So we know that it has its flaws relative to an exclusive methodology for teaching and learning, particularly in a rushed circumstances like we had. But there's also a lot of really bright spots of how we leverage this technology. And with that, I wanted to throw this back to you, Tim, because I know you and Lindsay have some perspectives about all of this and the focus that we're going to end up having relative to technology with the money that we're going to have available.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I'll just say on the learning loss front, the numbers have been coming in. We're halfway through the year. They're as bad, unfortunately, as we expected them to be, with a significant shift in how we connect with students and teachers. And there is some helpful data that we'll share in an article here. A really nice article came out about one way to offset learning loss is by leveraging technology at home to connect tutors to kids. So there's some really nice data behind how that helps specifically different subject areas, different grade levels. And again, it's a great illustration of how there's a human side to technology. We can have all the technology perfect, but if we don't have the right strategies, the right people in place doing the right things, we're not going to accomplish what we want with that tech. So as you said earlier, Kevin, being really thoughtful on how we spend the dollars, we have a little bit more time to be thoughtful and to think through our new strategies to deal with remote learning, to deal with hybrid learning, to deal with students being able to access from home anytime. I think this is nice to get that cushion, but it's also really time to evaluate what you did in that fall, like you said, with sort of like emergency, and how can you approach this a little bit better, knowing what you know now. So, with that in mind, I guess let's go ahead and actually let me just say one more thing. We have a really important article that we put out as a team on learning loss. And Lindsay, I know you wanted to share a little bit about that article here.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Tim. And I want to also echo the sentiment that Kevin made about the opportunity that we now have to be both, as you said, Tim, thoughtful and also strategic with new technology investments. And one of the key considerations here is to consider a comprehensive technology assessment that allows you to provide a clear picture of your district's network and your IT infrastructure. The data that you can collect with an assessment like this is going to help you to make really informed decisions about what investments you're going to make with this new bucket of funding to help you reach your desired instructional goals.
One of the things that I wanted to mention, because I've seen some of the comments in the chat, is we're not by any means saying that this crisis is over, but we all know, I mean, there is a big difference between being thrown into this thing overnight and having to figure out how we're going to do distance learning, and the perspective and the time we're going to have now that we've got an extra set of dollars that we honestly politically didn't think was going to happen. It ultimately ended up coming together. Now, for the longest time, we thought we might get something, but as the year grew short at the end of 2020, it didn't look like we were going to get something. So now that we've got this money, it does give us a chance to be a little bit more thoughtful. But you know, like everything we do in education, you got to have your track shoes on. We got to be ready to mobilize. But again, I do think the argument that we have the space and time to be a little more thoughtful is actually really valid. The other thing I wanted to mention too, Tim, that you might be able to point to, we got a lot of questions about folks wanting to look for how they're going to access the link that we have to the PowerPoint. And either Rachel or Tim, can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's going to be, we're going to post this video on YouTube. We're recording. We're going to post it on YouTube. Underneath the YouTube link, please, when you go to our YouTube channel, please subscribe. Underneath that YouTube link, you're going to see helpful links, right? So we're going to link to the articles. We're going to link to the PowerPoint. We're going to link to any additional resources that we've mentioned in this show. Additionally, we're going to send out emails to the Capital Advisors clients, to the Digital Advisors clients, and everyone who registered for this program. We'll send you an email with those links as well. So you'll have two options. One is an email that you can click on and find all the resources attached. The other would be to go ahead and go to the YouTube. The cool thing about the YouTube broadcast is you get to share it with anybody who wasn't able to make it here today. Share it with other people on your team that you think would find this useful. So thanks for teeing that up, Kevin. Yeah. And Lindsay, I want to go back to you and just reemphasize that the Digital Advisors team has this article on the technology do's and don'ts, how to spend one-time money. And you all just received a new infusion of one-time dollars. You have a little bit more time to be thoughtful, like we were saying. Lindsay's first point was really about the assessments, but Lindsay, any additional points that you want to drive home on the do's and don'ts that would be worth just chatting about right now?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely, Tim. So another consideration would be to think about updating and or replacing any legacy or old systems. So looking to automation to update your business systems, streamline approval processes, and or the onboarding of your staff and your students. Automation is going to help you save a tremendous amount of time and money over the long run. And in addition to that, and sorry, Kevin, did you want to?
Well, one of the things I was going to say is that remember that you always want to do this with the lens of linking it to, you know, the issues of connectivity, just being more efficient in delivering services ultimately to kids. That's what we do, everything that we do in a school, right? So when you take a look at the myriad of purposes that you're going to be able, that are allowable under this, there's no reason why you can't get to those issues that are sort of broader and more systemic that Lindsay's talking about as you think about where you're going to be investing these dollars. So a lot of these kinds of expenditures can be done. Now, one of the things that you'll note that was guidance from the state of California, and then we also got it from the IRS during sort of the midst of rulemaking on how we can use this money, were conversations about if you have something that was in your budget already in prior years that has no relationship to COVID or anything already, that becomes a little more problematic. But for a lot of districts, you don't have those kinds of limitations. But you do have to think about that if it was something that you're actually going to be spending money on that doesn't have any kind of relationship to these broad purposes and was a part of your budget, and you're using this money to pay for something you would envision paying for, that's frowned upon. So again, I do think there's going to be a lot of latitude because the what is provided in writing about what you can use these dollars for is just so incredibly broad. But again, you know, you're going to be working with your county offices, your own auditors to check on some of those kinds of things, and we can always be a resource on that as well.
So if I could just chime in, you don't have to push this money out the door in the next 6 months. And we'll talk about some deadlines later. But the important point to remember on this money, the new Ester, is that the deadline for expenditures is September 30th of 2022. So you can have time. If the vaccine's on the horizon, you have time, if you want to take it, to do some thoughtful planning about what you want your system to look like. You don't have to be purchasing, vending, doing whatever needs to be done. You don't have to do it immediately, as opposed to some thoughtful planning about where you want to be, not just where you are.
Tim, I was thinking maybe we should go back to the gear funding because I didn't get that covered.
Yeah, I'm sorry I jumped the gun on a bullet, Kevin. I mean, we can bounce back and forth, or we can just kind of let Lindsay finish through that. So if you want to jump into gear and then we'll jump into this, we can. I just was going to proceed with Lindsay doing her
Sure,
thing.
no, I like the idea of us covering any more of the do's and don'ts, Lindsay, that you have in mind.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin and Tim. I just have two more that I wanted to cover. So in addition to what I mentioned on automation, I saw someone in the chat say we want to focus on synergy. My comment on this would be absolutely an investment on single sign-on solutions, a robust online curriculum, and or learning management systems is going to greatly support your teachers, your staff, and your students as we continue in this distance learning and hybrid learning environments. And then finally, in closing, something of note is that it can be more costly to maintain and update old technology as opposed to buying new equipment when you consider the total cost of ownership for the long term. So something to note with this new bucket of funding, you've purchased devices, many of you this last year. You want to continue to support those. And if new equipment is needed, that could be a very worthwhile place to spend this new funding.
Great.
Thanks, Lindsay. And, Kevin, I had one job to do. That was to not jump ahead of any bullets. And of course, I went ahead and did it pretty early in the show. But I skipped over the gear funding. Everyone's really interested in this. We did have a question about, just some of the funding and particularly how it might hit Title I schools. I think you covered that pretty well, Kevin. We'll try to dig into some of the questions if we can. If we can't, everyone, we just want you to know Kevin and my email are going to be listed at the end of the show. You can feel free to email us with additional questions and respond to the email that comes out from our teams with the resources with additional questions if we're not able to get them on the show, because we have a lot to cover in the hour. So thank you for submitting your questions. If we can get to them, we will. And Kevin, please fill us in on the gear funding and what that means for districts this time.
And I can touch on that question, actually, Tim, that you raised with regard to Title I, is that, so one of the things that we'd automatically think about is that if you can't get access to the ESSER money because you're not a Title I district, is there a balancer? Is there an opportunity to get that balance by some other way? There are two opportunities. I'm not real optimistic, but there are two opportunities. And I know that there are legislators who are thinking about both small school districts that maybe, because of the districts that are not going to get access to ESSER, it's disproportionately really small school districts, rural and small school districts. So there are legislators who are actually concerned about that. Two things. One is this gear funding that's on this particular slide, the Governor's Education Emergency Relief Fund. There was a fund like that in the spring as well, and it was only $3 billion nationally, as Bob pointed out in a couple of slides earlier. But we got, just a huge amount of that. We got, just under $400 million that the governor used. And note that the rules on this money is that the governor can basically use it for anything he wants, education related, between early education and higher ed. Well, what the governor did in the springtime, he used it all for K-12. And so this time around, part of the motivation was because he was cutting schools and dealing with Prop 98 and a budget crisis. He was trying to compensate for that a little bit. This time around, he's going to have a lot less money. Governor Newsom's going to have a lot less money because the share that California gets, you need to understand that a big old proportion of that comes right off the top because they use the gear funding as sort of the route to deal with non-public schools, which was different than what we had last time around, which was kind of fuzzy. And Bob's going to talk about this in a minute. But what the point is that 2.75 billion of the $4 billion nationally goes to non-public schools. And there's got to be a backstory to this, right, Bob?
Well, the backstory is that, and somebody put it in the chat, if you recall, the equitable services provision of Title I, Secretary DeVos wanted to greatly expand the amount of money that was going from Title I to private schools. She eventually was beaten back. The courts ruled against her. This was a compromise that was reached in Congress to say that you wouldn't use more of the Title I dollars than you had been for equitable services, but there would be a fund set aside for private schools in the governor's fund. So that's the compromise that's there. But what it does mean is it safeguards most of the Title I dollars, and that's the lion's share of this bill.
So we're not going to be having a debate like we had before regarding Ester
and
dollars.
in fact, that's specifically precluded in this bill.
Yeah. So that big chunk of money that we have under Ester doesn't become any kind of a flashpoint regarding this. The focus on non-public schools is going to be in this GEAR fund, 2.7 billion of the 4 billion. So when you extrapolate to California, and these are just estimates, and it could be a little bit high, but I'm thinking we're going to get something between $400 and $500 million. It won't be 500 million, but it'll be probably in the 400 range. Who knows? But of that, the lion's share that will go to non-public schools. And then what the governor has left over to deal with, both from all the way from childcare to higher ed, will be only about $150 million. That money he could potentially use to try to ameliorate the gaps in what Ester does not achieve. The second part will be the governor's overall budget that he has, the state budget, which comes out this Friday. And the governor is going to have a situation where the revenue picture is dramatically better than what they estimated last year. And not only better in terms of getting us right side up with regard to cuts and deferrals and everything, but actually additional ongoing permanent money will materialize, we believe, in this budget. It's still yet to be determined how much, or how much the governor's even willing to spend on an ongoing basis. I think he could hold some of it back and use it for one-time purposes, trying to help balance things relative to districts that don't play with regard to ESSER funding could be part of the mix. If it isn't the governor's desire to do that, and I suspect that could be the case, that he's not interested in doing that, mostly because if you look at what he did last year in the budget, he put a huge emphasis on kids in poverty and unduplicated kids. He was less concerned about those that were not eligible for Title I. But we'll see what happens. But there is going to be some opportunities with regard to small chunks of money to try to balance this issue. And again, we really do want to leverage the sentiment that's out there with regard to the very small school districts that don't end up treated very equitably under this formula in the distribution of the money. So that's going to be an issue for sure, and we'll see how that plays out.
Hey, Kevin.
Yeah.
Quick question that came in, and I think it's important to touch on. In the Q&A, there was a question that said, are these dollars going to be used to pay down deferrals? I mean, I think I can speak to that because we know California is in a much stronger position than we anticipated, actually better than we anticipated even last March before the pandemic. So we're not anticipating those deferrals. Maybe you can speak to that. And then also, you're going to be doing your governor's budget workshops in a couple of weeks. Can you just answer that quick deferral question and talk about the workshops that you have coming up with your team?
Right. Yeah. So we're not looking for any of the federal dollars to help us relative to the deferrals, but there's plenty of one-time money that will materialize in this budget, enough so that the state Senate and the state Assembly, both houses of the state legislature, have let it be known that their top priorities of both houses is to pay down all of the deferrals. Now, the governor's, got his own budget that he's going to be putting up Friday, and we'll see if he follows along with the legislature's lead on that. It's going to be a possibility that the governor ends up continuing some of the deferrals for other kinds of financial priorities. My own very strong bias about this is that we as an education community have to be aggressively in favor of getting those obligations paid back while the state has the money to do so. This idea that it's okay to have them carry some of that money in deferrals. Remember, those are loans that are on the backs of our kids to help bail out the state's fiscal circumstances. We ought not like that to happen. And I know that we're in the throes of an emergency, and there's an interest in wanting to do a lot of testing and spend This is the governor's proposal, $2 billion on testing, COVID testing statewide with Prop 98 dollars. But we've got to make sure that paying down those deferrals is a very top priority. The legislature's with us on this issue. I think the governor will be as well, but definitely a separate issue. And Tim, thanks for the plug on the budget workshops. Those will be starting on the 19th. And you can go to our website at capitaladvisors.org. And that's capital with an OL, not an AL, capitaladvisors.org. And you'll see under workshops, all of the workshops that we've got slated. We're doing them across counties with the leadership of county superintendents who will be hosting those. So look for your county and sign up for that. And we're glad to have you on. The cost is the same price as this, which is $0. So we'd love to have you guys with us. So thanks, Tim, for giving me that opportunity.
Well, I don't know how we afford the CNN type news vans and production crew, but somehow we're doing this at no cost. So again, thanks for that, Kevin. And so we'll just to be respectful of the time, we do have quite a bit more to cover. Something that was in the stimulus package that everybody's been hearing about and waiting for is additional support with broadband, connecting to students and teachers that aren't on our sites. So Kevin, can you just walk us through some of the bullets on that broadband funding that we've seen in the stimulus?
Yeah, and I'm actually going to kind of depart from script here and ask for your guys' help, because I know, Lindsay, you and Tim both have thoughts about this. So I'll just talk about the bullet, and I'd really like your comment. The first is the $3.2 billion to subsidize access for connectivity. And what that is it provides, it's essentially aimed at, and you'll see it in that PowerPoint when you get a hold of it that you're going to link to. It has the details on it. There are at least 5 different levels of the way families or households, as they define it, qualify for this subsidy. It ranges between $50 and $75. That higher end are for education institutions, families on Indian reservations and American Indian tribes and others to access that money. The $50 is probably the dollar amount that will be mostly tapped into by the school district, most of the school districts that we serve. So there's that money. And I'm just not sure exactly how far that goes, particularly in the context of the next bullet, the $2 billion to replace China's Huawei equipment. So yeah, this company Huawei, which is a Chinese-based company, has sold equipment all across the state. And obviously, we know politically where China sits today and the politics of that. Basically, what was decided by Congress is we want to basically dump all that equipment, regardless of what you paid for it. And we're just going to spend $2 billion replacing it. So I know there's a connection between this. And what the funny thing about both of these items is you called this in our last week, and I think even prior to that, Tim, presentation about these two issues, and they're back and they're in the final package. So share some thoughts about that. And I know, Lindsay, you have some thoughts about it as well.
Yeah, and Lindsay, maybe I'll just ask you, and I may be going slightly out of order again here, but just, when you hear $50 per student and you think about the clients that we work with in small districts and remote locations, how does that sound to you? Or maybe just give us some thoughts if you have any on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Tim and Kevin. So, with all of this new funding, it's a great opportunity to invest in connectivity. And we all know that that's been a major challenge over the last year due to the pandemic. However, as both Tim and Kevin pointed out, that subsidy, which amounts to, roughly $50 per household, is not necessarily going to be a turnkey solution, specifically for students in rural geographies where there isn't internet connection running to those districts. So they've got a subsidy, but if they don't have an internet to connect to, they're still going to meet the challenge of not being connected. So again, it's great that the government is pushing investment towards connectivity, but I wouldn't say that the connectivity challenge is solved. It's complex, and we've got to keep working to get all of our students connected.
Thanks, Lindsay. And I'll just underscore that. If you follow the news on the digital divide, you hear a lot about the last mile. And the last mile is from a piece of fiber that's in the ground or perhaps up on a pole and the wire that connects to a house. So if you don't even have fiber in your neighborhood, good luck getting reasonable internet for $50. And if you have it on a pole, but it doesn't necessarily run to your house, no one's going to come and dig a trench in your neighborhood or to your house for $50. So, I love the spirit of this, that we're actually starting to address individual households. But we have very strong concerns on the digital advisors team that in rural districts, this is just not going to be enough, like you said, Lindsay. So I'll just add that that $2 billion is actually 2.3 or $2.4 billion that the government has earmarked to remove the Huawei and ZTE equipment, which is basically Chinese equipment. This is an extension of that trade war with China, and there's concerns that the Chinese equipment could risk our national security. That $2 billion is really kind of mind-blowing to me, because that's a lot of dollars that we could have used. Maybe we cut that in half. We send it over to how much we can give folks to get that home access. Maybe we can make a better dent, get $75 per student for every student or household, I should say, or perhaps $100 if we eliminated that line item altogether. And I guess, the challenge for me is we're going to replace gear that's working with new gear that's non-Chinese gear. And we're going to basically what I feel like is shortchange a lot of people who need more dollars to subsidize their internet connection. So I get a little fired up when I talk about this. I was going to give Bob a mute button for me today, so I didn't get too off track. But this one is definitely something that I feel concerned about, and I'm just scratching my head as to why that was such a big line item to remove that Chinese equipment.
Tim, if I can interject in there real quick about that,
Yeah.
The Chinese equipment. Again, that's why you need to engage the expertise of digital advisors, is because even though you're replacing that equipment, you can replace it with something that could address the problems that you just spoke about in a better way. Even though you're replacing the equipment, you can look at a little bit different functionality, something like that. But you've got to expand your vision a little bit. And I think we can be creative with those dollars a little bit. Even though we're just replacing equipment, we can expand the capability if we plan correctly.
Hey, Brian, I have a question. So when they have this in the bill, and obviously there's some politics involved here, we do have, pretty split Congress from a partisan standpoint, and they needed to get a deal. And this was, helpful in obviously getting it over the line. But do we have school districts that have Huawei too? I mean, is this permeate systems at every level of government, or where is this stuff?
It's all over, because it was cheap and it was very functional for a long time. So the equipment is in a lot of places. Yes.
So then schools would maybe be able to get some of the money to do the replacement as well, right?
Yes, correct.
Okay, so that's what you're talking about, is that, hey, if you're eligible, when you get money, you have some of this equipment and you can get some of it, make sure that when you're going to replace it, that you're upgrading to something that actually expands your capacity as well.
Correct. And protects privacy, et cetera. Correct.
Got it.
So if I could very quickly move back from China to Chino, and with a practical observation on the first bullet point, the $3.2 billion to subsidize access for low-income households. For district leaders, there's paperwork associated to this. And this is similar to the FCC's Lifeline program. It's not E-rate, it's Lifeline. And what that means is these families have to come in and get validated in order to qualify even for this, some would argue, minimal subsidy. So just be prepared. And the other part for district leaders is many of these families won't be aware of this. And so the importance of making sure that the students and the parents have some information about it, how to apply for it. And if they have to get, as I recall, one of the requirements is they have to establish that they're eligible for free and reduced lunch or something similar. So it looks, a lot of that's going to be coming, I think, through the district office or the school.
No, and a good point. There are five or six, I think it's 5 different sort of eligibility criteria. It's either or. You don't have to do all of them. You can do any one of them. And one of them, Bob, is the Lifeline. If you are eligible for Lifeline, you're eligible to get this subsidy. But the other one that I think is going to be more broadly used, and the one that we care about in education, is eligibility for the free and reduced school lunch program. So you have eligibility there, and it says in the bill that when you go to validate that you're entitled to this subsidy, that it's the school that will be relied upon to provide that validation. So we are going to be dragged into this, but we can also look at it as a positive, which is that if we're in communities where we've got, good numbers of kids that are obviously, especially unduplicated count kids, where you want those families to be able to access this resource, you're going to want to help them get that validation so they can get in line and get what they're entitled to under this bill.
Thanks, Kevin. And I'll just going to jump through the next couple of bullets here because we still have quite a bit more to cover in a limited amount of time. So, $300 million is set aside for rural broadband in unserved areas. We've seen a lot of investment from the governor, from basically $9 billion was even just recently awarded from CARES to help address this rural. So we're seeing a lot of rural broadband, and you know, that's generally code for more dollars that are going to go to service providers like the Verizons and Comcast to help get coverage out to areas that aren't served right now. Also $350 million for communities in minority serving education institutions and FCC's broadband mapping. And I know, Lindsay, we had some thoughts on that broadband mapping, but could you just kind of walk us through some of your additional thoughts on those on that bullet?
You're muted. There you go.
Thanks, Kevin. Yes, I think the investment in the FCC broadband mapping is incredibly critical. You know, there's still gaps for connectivity across the nation and specifically here in California. And so by investing in more mapping, we're going to be able to, in great detail, know where those gaps are, and we can then begin to work to bridge to get all of our kids connected. So that's a very meaningful investment.
Thanks, Lindsay. And it's interesting that your earlier point about the importance of doing an assessment first before you spend a large amount of money, our own government is not following, because they just awarded $9 billion to go provide rural internet access to folks like SpaceX and others. But they don't even really have an accurate coverage map of what's not covered. So it's really sort of the reverse, the cart before the horse is really what we're seeing here. But it is encouraging to see that they're going to make a significant investment in getting accurate mapping and really get coverage to places that just don't have it now. And again, just reiterating what you said earlier, if you haven't taken the time to assess your own environment, take the time to really understand where you are before you spend a lot of money to get to where you want to be. So I'll just reiterate that point from earlier. Any other additional points here that you wanted to touch on, Lindsay, before we jump out to the next topic?
No, I'm good. I think we're ready to move on.
Okay, so important to note that when, and Rachel, if you don't mind jumping into the cybersecurity piece, important to note that when you're going to get connected, you need to stay connected. And as we've seen in the news over and over, ransomware is shutting districts down, it's shutting businesses down. It's a real showstopper. It can stop you for days or even longer to get your data back and deal with this sort of data loss. So with that in mind, we do have one of the top cybersecurity experts here on this call, Brian Olson. And Brian, can you talk a little bit about cybersecurity, and Lindsay, if you had anything to add, if you wanted to help drive some of this, but just what are some of those things that districts need to be thinking on in terms of cybersecurity right now?
Really, it starts at the top. Cybersecurity just isn't IT anymore. It's at the leadership level. If you don't know your cybersecurity metrics about how many phishing emails you received, how many viruses you defended against, things like that, you need to know those metrics just like you know your educational metrics as well. And if you're a leader and you don't know those, then you're deficient in that area. It's not just about technology anymore. It's about policies, procedures, et cetera, et cetera. For instance, financial fraud is actually overtaking ransomware. We're seeing about $300,000 a week go out in financial fraud here in the Central Valley. And that's mainly policy and procedures. That's not technology. That's policies and procedures, educating your people, et cetera, et cetera. One key point, if you've got a 200 staff school, you're getting an average of 16 phishing emails a day. If you're not educating your staff, 40% of those emails are being clicked on. And that's the primary way that viruses get into and ransomware gets into your environment. So again, it's planning ahead, it's figuring out what the plan is, engaging people like digital advisors. If you're depending on your internal staff, nothing against your internal IT staff. They're great people, they're dedicated, but they're not cybersecurity experts anymore. And if you're expecting them to deal with the cyber threat, you're setting them up to fail. And they will fail, and you will get ransomware, and you will have to face this huge bill. And to top it all off, if you think you've got cyber insurance, those underwriting policies are changing very quickly. The requirements are. They're requiring you to do your due diligence. And part of that is doing risk assessment, seeing and planning for your cybersecurity defense. They're just not writing checks anymore to cover these losses because they're getting so great. You've got to be proactive and plan. So it's lots of things going on. Oh, one more thing I almost forgot to add is privacy with Prop 24. You may think you're exempt, but your vendors are not. So you have to be also on top of the privacy game as well, protecting your students' privacy. You've got to engage on that. So again, there's this huge universe that you've been thrust into with this remote learning, et cetera, that you've got, now we've all got to grow up and we've got to deal with privacy and cybersecurity. We've got to do it professionally. We've got to engage the experts and we've got to know what's going on. So reach out and get the help you need.
Thank you, Brian. I just want to put a little shout out to our friends in the site community. Site is California IT and Education. If you're not from the state of California, you're watching this, COSIN is the national brand there. You probably have your own state version of that. There's a lot of wonderful resources on cybersecurity, staying secure, that are free under that site website. So please go to site.org and check out more resources there. I also want to skip ahead to the next slide, Rachel, if you don't mind, and say that I'm very proud of the Digital Advisors team for coming up with actually a new offering for K-12. It's called Cybersecure K-12. And what, we were reacting with our clients, and what we've decided to do is build something that is actually proactive, an ounce, or I'll just say in this case, a pound of prevention. And we were actually engaged by a remote county office of education wanting to provide support to its districts in Northern California. Brian, can you talk about the collaboration that we've had with that county and what helped us basically build this new offering and what it entails?
Yeah, the demand is there. There is, just like in, we're talking about synergy and the focus on synergy is what we're trying to bring to schools, because again, schools are some of the most neglected for funding for cybersecurity from the state of California. I serve on the cybersecurity task force, and we have neglected schools for years and years and years. And it's really kind of a sad situation, but we're trying to rectify that. And working together to implement and again, the standard is the CIS top 20 controls. It's a standard that exists, that's blessed by the state. And we're trying to bring that to all of these districts that are wanting this. It's a great collaborative effort. And we look forward to educating you on it.
Thanks, Brian. I'll just say, for those of you who are kind of looking at this wondering what it really is, it's basically an ongoing support service for districts to help poke holes, find weaknesses in your network, looking at things like the phishing emails that Brian had said before. You should actually know your phishing score. So, he had mentioned something like 20-40% of phishing emails get clicked on. You should know that score. You should take efforts to work with your students, work with your teachers to make sure people aren't clicking on those malicious emails. And this is an effort to help you do those sorts of things. It's ongoing, and we're happy to put it out there. We will put a little link in the article that'll bring you to us, our website, to find out more on that. But again, we're really excited to be able to launch this. It's first of its kind in K-12, and we're really excited to be able to share that. So let's jump into the next topic here. We got some more stimulus to cover, and childcare and nutrition. Kevin, can you fill us in on that, please?
Yeah, and I did want to just do my own little plug, because there's so many viewers today that are not typically the viewers that we have week in and week out. Number one, I wanted to reiterate that we do this politics and tech. It's basically more of the same kind of news like we're presenting now every week. Tim and I do this together with our guests, Bob or Brian might be on. But I did want to point out that the relationship between digital advisors and capital advisors is not a coincidence. Sister companies that have developed innovation on the digital side that Tim leads for us. And it's just one of those areas, in addition to all the advocacy work that we do and the services we provide to districts, that there was definitely demand on the digital side, particularly kind of coincidentally in this last year. We came together well before this last year. We've been working together for a few years, but obviously a whole lot of demand is expanding in this area. But let me turn to then the remaining issues with regard to stimulus, and that's childcare and nutrition. And pretty straightforward. Again, in the PowerPoint that you will link to, that has a lot of this detail in it, it'll talk a little bit more about it. But the child care and Head Start programs, augmentation of $10 billion that's in the overall package that was passed, have a number of different things, uses that are described that you can use for. But typically, it's the mitigating COVID impacts. And again, very broad purposes within the area of childcare. On the nutrition side, it's really focused on expanding the SNAP benefits through June, and then also expanding the age requirement so that we can actually get to children that are 6 years old and under. So you'll see that described in the PowerPoint that we put together that I think you'll find to be really helpful.
Thanks, Kevin. We're in the speed round here, just to be respectful to people's time. So quickly run us through the deadlines, and then Bob, maybe you can jump in on what's not in the stimulus that we expected to see. Kevin, go ahead with the deadlines, please.
So one of the things we really wanted to mention, because everybody was watching it was a little bit of relief too late, which is that the Coronavirus Relief Fund rules about December 30th this year were extended to December 31st next year. Two things. One is they recognize there really are 31 days in the month of December. And then two, Bob pointed out that the new stimulus stuff goes through September of 2022 through that month. Somebody figured out that we actually have a school year, and getting it through the entire school year is a good idea. Our biggest frustration with this rush to spend money this year at the end of December was this lack of recognition that we had a half of a whole school year ahead of us, and that when you looked at the criteria for expending those funds, it had to be to mitigate issues that happened between March and December. Well, now that's opened up. So even though maybe you did spend most of the money, there are going to be a lot of issues from a pressure standpoint that are not as burdensome on you that would have otherwise been with the extension that we ended up getting. And then,
thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, Bob, you want to talk about, what's next?
So let me first talk about what's not in the bill. And then so what's not in the bill, because I think this is important. A lot is in the bill, and Kevin has talked about it in the slides that you'll be accessing on YouTube and elsewhere. Talk about it. But no school operates in a vacuum. So what's not in the bill? And this is one of the reasons the bill was able to pass, because it was slimmed down and things were taken out. Most significantly, essentially any aid for state and local governments was not in the bill. And that means that all the wraparound services that you look to from your state and local officials, particularly local, they don't have money to do that. 1.3 million state and local employees have been laid off or hours reduced already. And right now, no relief on the horizon. So that's not in the bill. Other things not in another reason this bill passed, education got to spend its money over a year and a half. Unfortunately, for the people that you're serving, the parents who are on unemployment, their benefits only extended until April. And so what that means is that $300 a week that you may have heard, that only lasts for 10 to 11 weeks. So if you're serving large numbers of unemployed or low income students, they're up against it in a fairly short period of time. Also, what was not in the bill was an extended eviction moratorium. The federal eviction moratorium expired on January 1. It was extended until January 31. Now, there is a $25 billion, this is national, $25 billion rental assistance program, but once again, families are going to have to apply for this. And so you may find a number of your families are very stressed out over their housing. So,
hey, Bob, can I just pause you for 1 sec? Yeah. I'm just going to say we probably have about 5 more minutes of content that we'll cover. Remember, this is being recorded. We'll post it on YouTube. If you want to go to the YouTube channel, you can just click and fast forward to catch the end, because there is a little bit more here that you might want to catch. So please continue, Bob. And we want to thank everybody for joining. If you have to drop, but we probably have like 5 more minutes if you can stay on.
Yep. So it's just important that I think principals, district leaders, others, and teachers, of course, understand there's a lot happening in the community. This bill for unemployment and many of the other benefits that families depend upon only went forward essentially to April 1. So what's next on the horizon is this just a down payment? Is the Biden administration elect says, or is this the final payment? And so that's what's going to be important then, is there additional stimulus? Will there be money for E-rate? E-rate is not in this bill. And much of the additional funding that you received with a lot of the flexibility, you may be choosing to use that to meet needs that otherwise somebody else should have been meeting, but wasn't in the bill. So all of which is to say that while you're planning and implementing, it's also important to be keeping track of what's needed, because a number of members of Congress are going to be coming back, and I think the Biden administration will be coming back to say, what's the next round and what should it look like?
Yeah, I expect that'll happen, but the answer to the first question is we'll know it tonight.
We will know
Yes.
tonight in Georgia.
If in fact the Republicans retain control, which is probably more likely, but who knows, Biden is going to have a lot of trouble getting any more stimulus passed, period. And if obviously it goes the other way, we can look forward to almost guaranteed we will get significant additional funds and stimulus. And there was one question that was raised about vaccinations. And I just want to mention, I think the governor is going to have some plans on that. And I think they are looking for, hopefully, federal resources to do it, but it's yet to be seen how that'll actually shake out. We'll hear a lot more about that probably Friday.
Thanks, Kevin. And, I'll just reiterate that every version of stimulus that we saw before the one that just recently passed had dollars allocated for E-rate. So the fact that there aren't dollars in there for E-rate is a little bit of a shock. There were also dollars that were being tossed around to help address cybersecurity, which we haven't seen any support for that either, to Brian's earlier point. There will be a new FCC chairperson, brought in with the new Biden administration. That will actually, we're expecting to see a lot of good changes to solve the digital divide when that occurs. But until then, we're without any support from E-rate, which is one of the best vehicles schools have to address connectivity. So, we'll hope that we'll see something here shortly with that FCC change, and perhaps as additional stimulus, we might see some dollars there. Kevin, we've seen some significant activity on California broadband bills, like the state trying to take connectivity into its own hands. Can you just tell us about a few of those bills that are out there right now being talked about?
Yeah, I mean, they were right away on the first day that the legislature had an opportunity to introduce legislation. We saw 4 bills immediately emerge, including Senator Lena Gonzalez's bill, Broadband for All. There's other legislation very much like it, actually. And so there'll be some competition to get ahead of the game on this. A lot of interest. I absolutely expect there to be a legislative compromise that'll be acceptable to the governor this year. A lot of activity in this area.
Well, look, so thanks so much for that, Kevin. And want to say thanks everybody for being on the panel today. Thanks everyone for joining us. The Capital Advisors team is going to be running those budget workshops in a couple of weeks. Make sure you subscribe to those. Governor Wise has a really nice article that he wrote with the former governor of Ohio about, how to come out of this crisis in a stronger position. We'll be linking that. We'll also be linking some of the other critical resources, the slide deck that we talked about that Kevin put together, the CyberSecure link to get more information on that. And we really want to say thank you for being here. Remember, we don't have a marketing team. You're a marketing team. If you like this show, please spread the word about K-12 politics and tech. Direct people to that YouTube channel, subscribe, and check out the show every week. We do offer this and try to provide some support. We get lots of great feedback from you. My final thing is there were a lot of questions that came in the Q&A. We'll try to answer those in emails back out to you. But here's our email addresses, ways to contact us if you want to reach out. So thanks, panelists, Bob, Brian, Lindsay, Kevin, Rachel, thanks so much for helping us run all this and making this happen. And everyone stay safe out there, and we'll look forward to talking to you soon.
So thanks again for joining us for another week of this broadcast.
And I just want to take a moment to remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel and share this out over social media. Again, you're our marketing team. I'll also finish by saying, if you have some questions, please send them our way. We'd be happy to address them on a future broadcast. So with that, thanks everybody, and we'll talk soon.